And just a second, the recording will start and we can proceed with the presentations. In the meanwhile, Christoph, if you have slides, you can share them.
May I start?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, so hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you, Konstantin, for inviting me. First, I have to start with an apology. I have no slides, but I recently came across a quotation by Oscar Wilde when he visited the Wild West. He saw a sign, "Don't shoot the pianist, he's trying to do his best." So I would like to extend this wish to my presentation because shooting me virtually would anyway be difficult. So, okay, so I try to do my best without slides. A subject is alternatives to rent control in the regulation of housing. Tenures is perhaps more correct than what is stated in the program than tenancies. So broader vision than tenancies, tenures. So the whole thing I'm going to present now is an outcome, a current project of the 10 Law group, originally financed by a European project. And it has as a starting point, how can law and legal regulation help attenuate the European housing crisis? So it's quite a legal policy motivation behind. And the other basic presumption is that rent control, as we have already been able to watch in the first session, is a quite ambivalent tool. I think that soft rent control, like tying the rent to consumer index, like collective bargaining about the rent as we have it in Sweden, or like a sort of econometric tool, statistic tool of measuring rents and giving some leeway, as in the German Mietspiegel, this rent mirror compilation. This all soft rent control. This may help to promote affordability of homes, but it does not create really new housing space. And but what is really, I think, from a comparative law experience, not good, is what is called here first generation rent control. Yeah, with rent freezes and sort of artificial tying, fixing of rents beyond the market. And I think there will be more speakers in the follow-up, but also the Berlin experience has sort of confirmed this. There was less offer on the market. There were more sales to self-users, because in order to realize the economic potential as a landlord, you can sell to self-users for whom, of course, the rent ceilings are irrelevant. And then there is, as shown also by the Austrian experience, but also by the Italian Equocanone experience, patti in deroga was mentioned by Aurora, and there were lots of circumventing and black market practices, like additional rents on furniture, on gardens, on cellars, or there's the phenomenon of ignoring the whole thing altogether, which is, by the way, also happening very much with the German rent brake, which is not at federal level, but it's not as strong as the Berlin rent cap mechanism. So our hunch, our intuition was that the rent control is not avoidable, but it's sort of ambivalent. So if you want to confront the housing crisis, something more is needed. And what could that be? It could be alternative and intermediate tenures. So forms of legally organizing the position of a home beyond rent and ownership, or more precisely, below rent and in between of rent and ownership. And we call this rent minus 10 years and rent plus 10 years and ownership minus 10 years, referring to the various degrees of stability of these 10 years. And our project was establishing a comparison of what is out there, of the so-called European acquis, if you want, a European acquis of housing tenures beyond ownership and rent, so as to enable exchange of best practices, mutual learning, so which is generally associated in European governance with the so-called open method of coordination. So sort of soft coordination, mutual learning experiences, which is typical for comparative law anyway. So first of all, we needed this taxonomy. And I have to be very short regarding rent minors, so less stability than ordinary market rent. The potential is very limited. It's quite obvious to a lawyer that any form of legalizing or partially squatting, as also mentioned by Sergio, is bad. I think this doesn't need more explanation. The only thing which might be interesting is what exists in Holland and the UK, and it's called property guardianship, which means that in exchange for doing without any tenant protection, I get a rent which is essentially lower than market or reference rents, say 50 or 60%, in exchange for no tenant protection. This is sold under the label of property guardianship, which is a euphemism, of course, because it sounds nice. You're the guardian of a property, means like a castle owner or something. No, in reality, you're a tenant minus. Yeah, you have no tenant protection, but you pay less rent. But this could still be, to a limited extent, if regulated well, perhaps a useful addition to housing tenures. But the main potential lies in what I just called rent plus and ownership minors, so intermediate tenures, as they are called. And there are so many out there that we had to structure them. And the provisional taxonomy was first old and new property rights, and for second, private governance structures, and third, forms of public-private cooperation. And of course, we are currently publishing a book on this, and I don't have time to go into all of this, but just a very superficial overview. So old and new property rights, which might be able to contribute to confronting the housing crisis. So there is usufruct and ground leasing or building leases or enfiteusi, diritto di superficie, and things like this, where the property of the ground is separate from the property of the house erected on it. And the ground may be continued to be owned, say, by the state, the municipality, by the church, or by a private landlord. And this has some potential because it can be used as a tool for urban planning by adding positive obligations in the lease contract, as it's done, for example, in Amsterdam. There it's quite prominent. For example, anti-speculation regulation, or a obligation once a developer acquires this building lease right, that he or she must build a certain number of social housing units on it. So these usufruct and ground lease schemes are apt to bring in additional, one might say, social and urban planning requirements, which can be good. Then other interesting phenomena, leasehold, so a temporary ownership, which was taken over by Catalan legislation, and it was called temporary ownership there. So to own a house, factually own, not always legally in the UK, but factually own a house for 10 years, which has as a consequence that the price, of course, is much lower. And this may be an interesting alternative. But experiences in UK about lease are not so good. And in Catalonia, I think Sergio and his team would be better placed to explain if there are any relevant experiences, because the scheme is relatively recent. Right to buy schemes have been mentioned by several national reporters who contributed to the project. Yes. And then the Finnish and Portuguese occupation right, which means that you pay 15 to 20% of the market value of the building to the landlord in exchange for a housing right, for a low rent, and a housing right which cannot be ended unilaterally by the landlord. So it's a sort of another in-between solution between rent and property. Second category, private governance structures. So what do we mean by this? Structures characterized by a strong degree of collective action in establishing, regulating, and in administering common dwellings. The classic one is, of course, apartment ownership. Yeah, and you have the equivalents in Scandinavia, which is a Finnish housing company, very interesting in details, and a Swedish-style cooperative. And of course the famous continental condominiums, which exist in many variations. They have, of course, it's a subject on its own, but I would conclude that their potential, there are intelligent legal designs on how to organize co-housing, but their potential to confronting the housing crisis is sort of limited. Yeah, it's limited because it's rare that really positive obligations, maybe in climate conforming modernization measures, something like this. But apart from this, I think it's difficult to see. Then there are the classic continental cooperatives, which exist in many countries, which have somewhat a bad reputation due to the communist experiences of the past, but which have been revived, but which generally depend on capital, the capital to establish the cooperative. Then there is a small variation of Austrian and German apartment house syndicates, meaning a network of non-profit private housing companies and working together in the provision of housing. Again, this is interesting as a theory, but it has been realized in practice so little that it's hard to tell anything about its overall chances or overall viability to act as a mean to confront a housing crisis. Community land trusts would be another private governance structure which come from the US, but which have been adopted in Belgium and France. But it must be said that they, in trust terms, you would say the settler, the one who gives the trust to, is mostly a public entity. So it's a sort of, public housing in some way. And it depends, of course, also on the availability of public money in Belgium and France, mainly to pay for the ground on which to erect houses which then belong to the trust and which will be given again according to social eligibility criteria to families in need. But again, another interesting model. Third and last model, private-public cooperation. I don't mean public or social housing in its classical sense, in which the state acts as a landlord in one way or another. So we have some schemes in which the state acts as usufructor, for example, in France and in Portugal, and a social sublease, that there is a private investment owner, and there's the social sublessor and social sublessees, which means then the families in according to social eligibility criteria. Then non-profit housing organizations is another big topic. They are very important providers of housing in the Netherlands and in the UK, and exist in many variations in other European states. But third and last category, models with state incentives for private housing provision. And this is what comes closest to the direct substitutes or the direct equivalents of rent control. For example, the German-French model of subsidies. You as a builder or a landlord, you get subsidies in exchange for low rents. You conclude a private rent contract with people, normally, again, people in need, but you get subsidies for building a residential unit which is then under an obligation in Germany of 15 years to practice only reduced rents. Second interesting scheme, Italian scheme of tenancies. If a landlord and tenant accept conditions, including a rental price negotiated by landlord and tenant associations, then the landlord will pay less tax on the rental income. Very intelligent system, I think, which again has received much acclaim. I heard during the COVID crisis, because landlords were not as sure as before on their tenant being able to pay the rent. So one more minute, if I'm allowed, perhaps, to conclude this. Yeah. So public subsidies, again, in exchange for lower rents. And a third category to be found in Benelux, but in many other countries, tenancies mediated through social agencies, social rental agencies. So social agencies collecting housing units from people who don't want to have direct contacts with tenants. So the whole administration is done by these social rental agencies, but the owners get a public guarantee on a minimum rent, which is of course lower than the market rent.
So 17.
So it's two sentences on a conclusion. So what can be learned from the project? Because I think this is interesting for everyone here. What's the sake of the whole thing is, first, an exchange of best practices, to widen the spectrum to spread of available housing tenures is a good thing in itself. Just as in the economy, it's recognized that a diversification of products on the market, here on the housing market, is good for everyone, because it leads to a growing of the economy. So this analogy. Second, what is needed is not an instrumentalization of private parties, as it's happening in Catalonia, for example, again, and it has happened in many states of first-generation rent control. So not an instrumentalization of private landlords who have to bear the brunt for low rents, but an intelligent role of the state, as shown by these last examples, an intelligent role of the state to invent models which cost less than direct public housing, but which nevertheless enable the creation or enable constructs with lower rents. Okay, so this was this presentation. Thank you, and I hope.
Thanks a lot, Christoph. Do we have some questions? I think yes. No, it's not raised hand, it's applause. Okay, then waiting for other comments, I would make you a provocative question. So you were referring to Catalonian examples, but here in Berlin, just a few weeks ago, we had a referendum on nationalization of housing. And therefore, I'd like to ask you about, let's say, your opinion and what would be doable, feasible alternatives to this policy?
I'm not, probably you are better informed than myself. I think I'm against, so to be very brief, I'm against this socialization, because the winners would be arbitrary, sort of, because the state could, of course, not buy back everything, because the full compensation would be needed with the socialization. It sounds nice, but it will cost a fortune to the city of Berlin, and the city of Berlin is poor, so it would be limited from the outset, the number of housing units which could be bought back, basically. It's called socialization, but as a matter of fact, it's buying back by force, buying back from private investors housing units by public constraint. And so even worse than with the rent cap, you would have people who get an advantage, a privilege, because they happen to be assigned one of these bought back apartments. But this could not cover the whole mass of people who are currently looking for an affordable apartment in Berlin. So I think, as the mainstream economists also say, it's not. I think it's not a good way forward. And the new mayor, who's famous for her academic plagiarism, the new Berlin mayor, it will probably not go for it. I think because their money is simply not there. So it may be a nice idea, but I think it will not take place because the money is not there. But we have people from Berlin who may have more qualified opinions on this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think we don't have time for the further discussion, although it would be, of course, very interesting to hear.